So these sanctions against, it's a visa ban against Elor Azaria. Does that sort of imply that he hasn't had that his treatment, the treatment of his case by the Israeli authorities was not fully in line with the standards of justice that the US would like to see?
So we have made clear, let me speak to it generally first, and I'll speak with respect to his case. We have made clear that we want to see appropriate accountability for those involved in violations of human rights in the West Bank, those involved in actions that of violence that threaten Palestinians or actions that threaten Israelis. With respect to this particular statute under which he was designated, we are actually required to impose visa restrictions if we find a violation of if we find a gross violation of human rights. So I think there are people who will, obviously there was an action that the IDF took against him, right? He did serve time. And I think people can appropriately question whether that was the right amount of time or not. But we are actually separate and apart from that analysis. When we find a gross violation of human rights by a government official, and we did find a gross violation of human rights by this official, we are required to impose this measure whether or not the government of Israel has taken its own accountability measures.
Right, and so this was one of the cases that was involved in earlier this year, the Leahy determinations that you guys made. According to the memo of justification that the organization Dawn obtained and posted online, it includes a discussion, it's a State Department document, but includes a discussion of the case and says Secretary of State determined that the government of Israel is taking effective steps to bring to justice the responsible member. So they're specifically talking about this case, but isn't there like a mixed message here if you're also saying this is 8 years after the fact, but we're taking this action against this individual, but you're also saying justice has been done in this case.
So as I just noted, whether you believe the steps that they have taken are appropriate or not, and we did find that those steps were appropriate for remediation under the provisions required by the Leahy law when it comes to continue to provide training and assistance to that unit. Separate and apart from that analysis, whether you believe that appropriate remediation measures or appropriate accountability measures have been taken or not, if we find a gross violation of human rights, and we did here, we are required to impose this visa restriction. So that's what we have done.
Right, but I guess people would say, people would look at this and say, well, you're imposing a sanction on the individual, but the institution that he's part of, the whole point of the Leahy law is to stop U.S. assistance going, weapons and assistance going to units that are involved in human rights violations. In this case, you've determined that this was a gross violation of human rights. I think he ended up serving 9 months in prison. As you said, it's debatable, but isn't there a question here over whether you're really following the spirit of the Leahy law, where this unit is still able to receive U.S. weapons?
So the purpose of the Leahy law, it's not just, I think that misstates the purpose of the Leahy law. It's not in every instance to just suspend military assistance. What we are trying to do, what the Leahy law exists to do, is to incentivize foreign governments to take corrective measures when units commit violations of human rights. So that's why the Leahy law has written into it, if you find a violation of human rights by a unit, military assistance isn't immediately suspended. You have to look and see whether they've taken appropriate accountability measures and appropriate remediation measures, because we want governments to do that. I think it's true about every military in the world that there are times in conflict where you're going to have individual soldiers and individual units who act outside the code of conduct of that unit or potentially act outside the laws of war, and you judge the country by whether they have a system that corrects for those violations and holds people accountable. And that's what the Leahy law is trying to incentivize.
So do you think that someone who's been found guilty of extrajudicially killing an unarmed Palestinian, given everything you've said about the need for action to be taken to make sure stability is maintained in the West Bank, this is a very sort of febrile atmosphere there. Cases like this have contributed massively to that instability. So the institution that we're talking about has basically concluded that that crime needed a 9-month jail sentence, and that's sort of that's sufficient. Do you agree that that's sufficient?
So I'm going to answer that in a rather than weigh in on one specific sentence, which ultimately that is a question for the Israeli legal system. I'm going to say that on behalf of the United States, we look at it broadly and say that when you look at across the West Bank, the amount of violence that has been carried out against Palestinian civilians, there hasn't been appropriate accountability across the board. And so that's why we have, number one, called on Israel to take additional measures to hold those responsible for violence accountable. And it is why we have announced these two policies that I outlined at the top of the briefing. The new visa restriction policy that the Secretary outlined in December, and the executive order that the President put into place in February. And under that authority, under those two authorities, we now have the ability to impose financial sanctions, and we have done that on 22 individuals and entities. And we have the ability to impose visa restrictions, which we have done in dozens of cases. So we are going to continue to call on Israel to do more across the board. I think it's important that this broadly is not about any one isolated case of violence. This is about a broad trend of increased violence that we have sadly seen over the past months, and the need for Israel to do more to hold people accountable for it. And that's why we are taking the steps of our own to hold.
But you had the opportunity in this case. There's a detailed case here that you've named this individual in a press release. I'm not sure whether you were required to do that. But it's quite clear in this case when it comes to, with reference to the Leahy law, when it comes to the question of whether to restrict weapons to the Israeli military, you're willing to take these steps up to that point, and then at that point, you're not willing.
Because we just look at the facts as they're applied, and our determination was that with respect to this particular incident, that the unit had appropriately imposed accountability measures, and because of that, remained eligible for assistance under the Leahy law. That doesn't change the fact that we felt it appropriate and are in fact required to impose this visa restriction today, and that broadly across the board we haven't seen enough accountability, and that's why we're taking other steps.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this case, Azaria, I think it was 2016, right?
I believe so, yeah.
You know, we're in 2024. I mean, it's kind of silly to remind you, but
so
8 years later, why are we even talking about this case
because
now?
we have been taking a broad look over the past few months at increased violence in the West Bank. We have seen a trend of increased violence in the West Bank, and that trend has accelerated after October 7th. And that's why you saw the department announce new visa restrictions, or new visa restrictions of policy in December, and that's why you saw the President announce the new executive order in February. And so we are looking broadly at violence in the West Bank and taking accountability measures in response.
This is violence 8 years ago.
My point is,
take their accountability for what's happening now.
My point is,
we
are taking. If you look at the other sanctions that we have rolled out over the past several months since the President's executive order, you have seen us impose sanctions for actions that have been taken in the past few months. So we are doing that.
Yeah.
We are looking broadly at violence we have seen in the West Bank, and where we believe accountability is appropriate, we're imposing it.
And you can't name the other individuals?
No, and the reason why, I know it's a little complicated, I often stand up here and say that we can't, visa records are confidential and we can't get into them. There is an exception for this first case. It just comes to do with the quirks of the law. Azaria was sanctioned under authorities we have under the State Appropriations Act. And under those authorities, we are allowed to name individuals' identity when we impose visa restrictions. The others, and that's for a finding of gross violation of human rights. The others on whom we've imposed visa restrictions, and this is true for the other dozens of individuals for whom we've imposed visa restrictions in the past few months, we are imposing those restrictions under the Immigration and Nationality Act, and the text of that law mandates that we keep the names confidential.
Can I just follow up on a timeline?
Ask Congress why it's written that way.
How far back are you guys going in this process in terms of looking at cases that could be considered to be subject to the EO or the new visa restriction policy that the Secretary laid out?
I don't think I want to get into that from here, other than to say, as I noted, we are looking at broadly at violence in the West Bank and actions that undermine the security and stability in the West Bank, and we will not hesitate to take additional measures. You've now seen, I think, a pretty steady tempo of visa restrictions. I'm not going to give it time. You have seen a pretty steady tempo now over the past few months of financial sanctions and visa restrictions coming out of this department, and you should expect accountability measures to continue.
Can you just help us understand, though, the process a little bit more? Because it seems you rolled out some restrictions for action that's been taken in the last few months, and then there's this one of 8 years ago. I mean, it's a little bit confusing to understand what kind of process is being embarked on here.
Well, I'm not going to get into the full process, but as I just said in response to Leon's question, we are responding to the actions that we have seen in the West Bank and the very disturbing increase of violence in the West Bank. And so we are looking at those acts and looking at responses the government of Israel has taken, if any, in reaction to those acts, and then making determinations about whether additional measures are necessary on behalf of the United States.
And then just one last thing, you said that there hasn't been better accountability across the board when it comes to Israel. Is there any broader action that you guys would consider taking? I mean, if you find all of these violations have occurred, is it as meaningful to go after individuals? Perhaps like the IDF itself needs to be targeted?
So when it comes, first of all, I will say, when it comes to the impact of these sanctions, if you look at the complaints over the past few months from the individuals that have been sanctioned, if you look at the complaints from officials with the government of Israel, they certainly don't think these measures are effective because they have been quite loud in complaining about them and quite loud in
they do or they do not think?
They do. They do not think they haven't been. They think they've been ineffective. I probably got lost in a double negative there. If you just look at the time period since we have been imposing these measures, you have seen quite vociferous complaints from those who have been sanctioned, those who have had visa restrictions imposed on them, and from officials with the government of Israel. So they certainly seem to believe that these measures are effective. And I will note, part of the point of taking these measures is not just to impose accountability on people who have engaged in acts of violence or people who have engaged in other acts that increase instability in the West Bank. It is also to let others know that we are paying attention and we are watching and we are not going to hesitate to act.
Any noticeable change in their action if they're so frustrated about all this?
So we have seen the government of Israel taking some steps to crack down on settler violence in the West Bank. We have seen them at times stopping settler violence and at times arresting those engaged in it, but those steps have not been sufficient. And so we continue to call on the government of Israel to take further steps.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed the top, or maybe even more than just the top. But in response to these questions right here about this latest sanction that you introduced, you say that you're judging their effectiveness by the loudness of the complaints?
No, the question was about whether they are effective or not, and we believe that they have been effective.
From the people who have been targeted, and complaints from the Israeli government mean that they've been effective, or just that they're angry?
We believe they have been effective, separate and apart.
How?
From we believe they are effective on imposing accountability, both with the visa restrictions. And remember, we have imposed financial sanctions as well on individuals that restrict their ability to interact with the United States financial system. My point of that is, if these weren't effective, if these weren't imposing a cost, I don't think you would see such loud complaints both from those targeted and from the government of Israel.
Yeah, but the cost is that these people can't travel to the U.S. Their families can't travel to the United States, and or that any assets that they might have in the U.S., which questionable whether they have any, right?
It is not limited to that, only because I think, as you know, because having watched sanctions for a long time, an inability to interact with the financial system often makes it hard for people to carry out all sorts of banking and other activities.
But in order for sanctions to be effective, they actually have to, I mean, the idea is to change behavior, right? And I think this is what Kylie was getting at. What behavior have you seen change?
We are early in this process, and I think it is too early to pass judgment one way or the other. As I said though, if we had seen a completely satisfactory change in behavior, I think we'd be done. You wouldn't see us imposing additional sanctions and additional visa restrictions. But we continue to see unacceptable levels of violence, and so we're going to continue to taking these steps and continuing to call on the government of Israel to do it. This is not, I'll just say, this is not something that happens overnight, right?
I get
it's
it, but isn't that
a sustained campaign by the United States. And I should also make clear that this is not a problem that can be solved by sanctions and visa restrictions alone. Ultimately, it takes action by the government of Israel, and that's why we continue to push them to take additional action.
Isn't that an admission that they haven't worked so far?
No, it's not. It is.
If you're having
no,
continued doing that. I mean, look, this is an argument we get into with sanctions on any country: North Korea, Iran, Russia.
And
What
their
behavior has changed?
They are one tool.
As a result of
They are one tool that we have to impose accountability and to create incentives to hopefully prevent others from taking actions if they're thinking about the costs that can be imposed upon them. But they are not the only one.
Thank you, Matt. Before I ask my question, just to clarify, what about settlers that may be U.S. citizens or U.S. born? I mean, there are a lot of them that have been committing acts of violence and other acts from Kiryat Arba, from the Hebron area and so on. Names are, they're there. Will they be requested to be extradited? Would you do something like this? I'm just trying to clarify.
So you can't make an extradition request absent a criminal indictment. So that's the first line. And obviously we don't do criminal indictments in the Department of State.
So you would have to wait for the Israelis to indict them criminally?
No, well, you wouldn't request to extradite someone who had been indicted in another country.
Okay.
It would be for an indictment in the United States, but we're getting...
Okay, now expanding these, these sanctions and so on, would you expand it to include the Smotrich, who is a very